How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today we're discussing the power of zero, a zero-emissions electric grid, zero-emission transportation, zero-emission buildings, and zero-waste manufacturing. Improvements in those four areas could help bend the carbon curves towards zero and even down into the realm of negative emissions. Then we could all breathe a lot easier. Zero-emission pathways are visible, but at what cost to industry and consumers? What new technologies and policies will be required? How are the recent elections shaping the path forward? Here to explore those questions, we're pleased to welcome back three experts to Climate One. Kate Gordon is a former advisor to Tom Steyer, Hank Paulson, and Michael Bloomberg. After we recorded this show, she went to work as a top policy advisor to Governor Jerry Brown. Hal Harvey is CEO of Energy Innovation, a research and consulting firm. He received the Heinz Award for the Environment in 2016. Arun Majumdar is co-director of the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford. He formerly held senior positions at Google and the U.S. Department of Energy. Later in the show, we'll talk about how philanthropists, large and small, are engaging in the climate challenge. Hal Harvey, we're talking about zero-emission electric grid. In fact, there's some suggestion that the fires in California were started by perhaps a downed utility line. Zero-emission electric grid, that sounds possible in California. Is that something that can spread nationwide? Voters, again, push back on that in Arizona and some other places.
Now, people automatically think that if you go to variable sources like wind and sunshine, you need huge batteries to carry you through the night or through a long, cold winter week in North Dakota. It turns out there are half a dozen ways to deal with the variability problem. The first is geography. The winds in California and the winds in Wyoming are not correlated. They happen at different times. So when you hook them together with good transmission lines, which exist in many parts of the country already, they smooth each other out. Same thing goes with solar. If you have solar in Nevada and solar in California, they're going to have peaks at different times, and they smooth each other out. You can continue right across the Sunbelt there. So that's just one example of ways to balance the system. Let me offer one more, which is regional variations of demand.
Right.
So Seattle and San Diego never have the same peak demand, and they have different energy supplies. Copper wire is magic between those two because the Bonneville Power Administration becomes the battery for San Diego. And San Diego can shoot excess energy to the data centers in the Microsoft Amazon zone when it's needed. The point here is we can move to a zero carbon grid much more quickly and at net savings than anyone thought possible even 5 or 10 years ago. And there are a number of states that are well on the way.
But Kate Gordon, you spent some time in Wyoming, and they don't necessarily want their grid connected to California. So there's a lot of politics in the electrical grid that is, Texas has their own grid, thank you very much, not connected to anyone else. So the politics of the grid are fierce.
It's funny. I was just in Wyoming 2 weeks ago, and I was in Idaho 2 weeks before that. And I will actually tell you, in Idaho, they do want their grid connected to California because they have an enormous amount of hydropower. It's very cheap, and they want to sell it to us. They see California as a big market full of consumers that just voted in a 100% clean energy bill that they can then supply through hydro, through potentially negative emissions from their forest sector. I mean, it's very interesting. It's sort of a turn on what you'd think, because you go to Idaho and you're from California, and I'm used to people not listening to me because I'm from California. But now all of a sudden there's this different story, which is, oh, these guys are really close to us, we have access to their market, and they want our stuff. And I think that's interesting. And we may see some of that in Wyoming too. Wyoming's a little more challenging because 70% of Wyoming's state economy comes from extractive industries. It's all coal, and now coal going down, but gas going up. So they're in a little bit of a different position. They're worried about getting connected to a grid that has a 100% energy standard. But I still think there's a message out there that we could become I think the Western grid conversation could be opened up by this idea of California really creating markets for some of this stuff.
The biggest wind farm in America is being built in Wyoming today.
Yeah, that's right.
And
They like wind a lot.
So one other thing to keep in mind is 2/3 of all renewable energy built in America has been built in so-called red states.
Right.
So this is not an R versus D.
A lot of it
This
Texas.
is a smart versus
Yeah.
not so smart thing.
Yep.
And Arun, Majumdar, one of the things here is to talk about electrifying everything, which would then grow the grid. So tell us about the path for electric adoption, electric vehicles, basically electricity is cleaner, cheaper than kind of burning fossil fuels.
So the issue about electric vehicles is really about the cost of batteries. And if you look at over the last decade, R&D in materials that goes into the batteries has brought down the cost of the batteries by a factor of 5 to 6, which no one had predicted 10 years ago. I was in the Department of Energy, we were investing, we were hoping, and it happened faster than we thought. If you look at, now it's about $150 to $200 a kilowatt hour of a battery. In the next 5 to 7 years, we anticipate, based on the innovations that are going on, again, in the materials and the packaging and all that, it'll come down to $100 a kilowatt hour. What does that mean? At $100 a kilowatt hour, in the next 5 to 7 years, the electric vehicles will reach cost and range parity with gasoline cars without subsidies. And by the way, it has less moving parts, it's low maintenance, and it's got a really good acceleration. So if you want to go 0 to 60, this is great. And so if you put all that together and you look for consumer attractiveness to this, I mean, this is amazing. Why wouldn't you do that, right? So right now, and this is about, we're talking about the United States, most of the EV adoption is going on in China. And India is planning to do the same because they are importers of oil. This is national security. And so if you look at the EV adoption, I think we're going to see, we're in this early stage of this S-curve, and this is going to go steep like this. The challenge, and this comes back to the grid, is can we, if you have, we have California with about 5% penetration of EVs. At 50% penetration of EVs, it'll be like going to the airport and trying to look for a charging place for your phone. And that's what we don't want to get into. It could introduce volatility on the demand side of the grid. And you have volatility on the supply side as well because of renewables. And the question that we all have to kind of address, both with technology and policy, et cetera, how can we connect the two in ways that can even out the fluctuation and actually make it more stable and more affordable in the future? And that's a challenge that we all have to face.
There's another powered element to that, Hal Harvey, which is the oil companies and the electric utilities are now competing with each other. They're now swimming in each other's lanes. The electric utility industry, as you say, is largely state, more local. The oil industry is very centralized. How is the power dynamics changing as these big industries now kind of are looking at each other's lunch?
Well, one of the reasons that carbon tax went down in Washington is because the oil companies spent mightily to defeat it. What's beginning to happen as we turn the grid to zero carbon electricity and then electrify everything is the utilities come on side on environmental issues. The Southern Company, which is one of the grand old monopolies covering five or six states in the Deep South, has said publicly, we'll put all the solar in you want as long as we get to own it, right? PG&E, Southern California, Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric. California utilities have done heroic work on renewables and on EV charging. I think the way to go is to give the utilities the incentives to become the engines of this transition and let the oil companies just try to keep up. The only way to defeat oil is to crush demand for oil. And the best way to do that is to provide the same services in ways that are both cleaner and cheaper.
But Kate Gordon, a lot of the politics of defeating oil are aimed at stopping pipelines, villainizing oil companies, attacking supply. That's what a lot of environmental and political campaigns aim to do. Is it effective?
I mean, oil is complicated because it's a global commodity with very global price fluctuations. So we love to talk about oil as if it's some local thing where, one of the big things that happened in Washington was all of this advertising saying gas taxes would go up, and you got all these rural commuters who have to go an hour and a half to get to the hospital getting worried about gas taxes. That was the conversation. We've seen it here in California. In fact, that gas taxes don't go up materially because of local policy, even local tax policy. They go up materially because of disruptions in supply, including, by the way, Hurricane Harvey, which disrupted supply. Katrina disrupted supply. So it's challenging because it's a very global conversation, but you can use it, manipulate it locally. I think, therefore, local battles against oil don't do that much to disrupt the global supply chain. They're important because they build a base of environmental activists. They're important because it's a target that's easy to go against. I think there have been some really effective campaigns. The divestment campaign actually has been really interesting because it didn't actually lead to a whole bunch of divestment from oil, but it led to a lot of really important conversation about reinvestment in other things and about portfolio diversification and about volatility and all kinds of stuff. That's been really important.
Hal Harvey, there's, by your estimates, going to be another $2 billion gasoline cars built.
2 billion in number.
2 billion in number. A lot of people don't like to hear that. We say we have to get off gasoline. We have to get away from gasoline cars. There could be another billion built. How much room is there to make the internal combustion engine more efficient? Is that for real, or is that just kind of a Detroit, party line?
There are huge opportunities to make cars more efficient. Both the engine itself, right now the average engine in a car is a pathetically inefficient machine. Right now, only about 10% of the energy you put in the car actually moves the car. So the engine starts off by losing more than 60% of it in forms of heat up the radiator and the exhaust pipe. But there are other frontiers we should pay attention to. Aerodynamics is getting better. Why is the underbelly of your car rough and the top smooth? An airplane, the whole thing's smooth. For example, lightweighting, huge frontiers. The BMW i3 is carbon fiber from the knee up and aluminum from the knee down, and it weighs 1,300 pounds less than the average American car. It's a beautiful electric car.
The Ford F-150 is now aluminum.
The Ford F-150 bed is aluminum. General Motors is offering a carbon fiber bed in their pickup truck. Better tires, reduced auxiliary loads like lighting, and even changing the paint. They have now these molecularly reflective paints that drop your engine, the interior of your car temperature by 10 degrees, and they're the same color. They look the same. And you can do the same with the glass. So there's no reason trucks shouldn't push into the 35 plus miles per gallon and cars well into the 50s without changing function or safety.
Arun Majumdar, are robotic cars going to push EV adoption because robotics, easier to have a robotic car that's electric than internal combustion, or is that just going to not be a factor? It's going to make more cars out there because we don't care who's driving them.
So when you say robotic cars, I suppose you mean
Autonomous.
Self-driving autonomous car. I think fully autonomous cars on the streets, I don't think that's going to happen in like very soon, because we just had this conference, our forum called the Stanford Global Energy Forum 2 weeks back, or 10 days ago. And we had the person who actually designed it for Google, Chris Urmson, talk about our technology and how they're doing it. I think there are lots of, when we actually look at fully autonomous, that you don't need the driver, there are tons of issues that we have. I mean, the point that he made was that driving is actually a social activity. When you're trying to merge onto a freeway, and you think about it, there's a social connection that is going on, and to emulate that on a computing platform is non-trivial. I think what will happen is that there are lots of places where the autonomy is actually going to assist the driver to reduce accidents, and thereby actually save lives. And I think that's where we'll first see. There's a lot of business incentive to make it fully autonomous because it'll remove the Uber driver so that they actually, it reduces the cost. But I think we'll see on trucking, on some lanes, we'll see that. And that actually is really important because the truck drivers are driving hours that they should not be driving, and that'll reduce the number of accidents. So I think there are other factors that will drive this than just purely economy.
Well, and those safety points go to lightweighting too, because one of the reasons we require cars to be so heavy right now is because of safety concerns. If those safety improvements are put in, you could see a faster adoption of some of the lightweighting technology, which is pretty cool.
So technology assisted. Humans are still playing a role in there with lots of technology around them to keep us from doing the stupid stuff that we do.
Right.
I'm not dead yet.
Philanthropists, large and small, are engaging in the climate challenge. Where's the money going, and what are the big wins and losses? How does climate rate among total philanthropic giving? Joining us today is Larry Kramer, president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the world's largest philanthropic funder of climate protection. Farhad Ibrahimi is founder of Chorus Foundation. As a teenager, he inherited a significant amount of money that made him uncomfortable, prompting him to create Chorus Foundation. Tate Williams is a Boston-based reporter for Inside Philanthropy, where he writes incisive articles examining charitable foundations. Tate Williams, let's begin with you. 2006, An Inconvenient Truth comes out. There's another big intergovernmental panel on climate change report. U.S. popular opinion is at then an all-time high. Take us through the 2006 to 2010 when things ended up in a different direction.
Yeah, so that sort of period of time I think looms really large in climate philanthropy and for like the environmental movement in general. And I think the philanthropic story starts, I think, with Design to Win. And Design to Win was a report that about, I think it was 5 large climate foundations, they basically commissioned it. They commissioned some consultants to put together a report that would sort of say, look, if we put some money together and we really focused on this, what's the best way that we could be a climate leader and really make a dent in this issue? And what they came back with was a very sort of policy-focused, it was very mathematical, very engineering-focused. It was sort of framed climate change as a math problem. And it focused a lot on policy expertise, technical expertise. That was kind of like the theory of change, that if we present this expertise to decision makers, then they'll make the right choices. And then that sort of created an entity called ClimateWorks. And ClimateWorks was put together as a way to sort of carry out that agenda. And it very much sort of set the stage for the next, in some ways it still is kind of setting the stage for philanthropy, climate philanthropy. And a big part of that agenda was some sort of a carbon market in the United States. And so that sort of ended up being not directly related, but ClimateWorks and then the supporters of ClimateWorks ended up backing the cap and trade bill that ultimately went down in flames in 2009. So I think that there were a lot of lessons about what happened after cap and trade, and there's been lots of sort of autopsies and fingers pointed about how it went wrong. The environmental community, namely the big foundations and the big NGOs, had essentially made an end run around the grassroots. They had sort of taken a shortcut around movement building and went straight for the meetings with the elites and sat down with industry, came up with a compromise, and they had a bunch of industry on board and they had a lot of leaders on board. But, this sort of one of these conclusions is that they just didn't fund the grassroots. They didn't support the grassroots to the extent they needed to.
Larry Kramer, today the Green New Deal became more real. There's a bill introduced, but one of the same co-sponsors is the main piece of legislation just about exactly 10 years ago. So the political context has changed. How is the philanthropic response going to be different today, learning on the lessons that Tate Williams, whether you agree with them or not, learning on the lessons from the last 10 years?
Yeah, well, so I agree and not exactly disagree, but I think there's a little more to the story. So one, Design to Win is, and we have always thought of the problem as a global problem. So this is mostly about the United States that Tate is talking about. And when we think about what we need to be investing in, so you're not going to do the same thing in China or India or Indonesia or Mexico or Brazil or Europe as you're doing in the US. And a very large portion of the philanthropy is outside the United States as well. Two, the context in the United States did change significantly in the sense that the perception was that at the time ClimateWorks was launched, in fact, governments, including in the US, were ready to take action, so there was less perception of a need to build a movement. And of course, there's a lot of 2020 hindsight, but there's no question that the political dynamics changed after Obama's election. And the oil companies mobilized in a way. And it's both not just the failure of cap and trade, but also Copenhagen. And that caught us by surprise. There's no question there. And there's been a lot of changing since. At the same time, just two other quick points. One is, and this is not just about us, and I don't mean this to be defensive, I mean it for people, there is a wide perception that we're like failing in this movement, and that is absolutely not true. In 2007, the globe was on track for, say, 5 to 6 degrees warming by the end of this century, which is civilization ending. We are now, between what's been done and pledged, on track for, say, 2.7 to 3.2. And when you think about the fact that the entire globe was running on fossil fuels, the entire world economy, that is unbelievable progress, really one of the most successful philanthropic movements in history. Now, we still have a degree or a degree and a half to go, and that last degree and a half is way harder than the first.
I want to get Farhad Ibrahimi in here in terms of your view on whether philanthropy is winning, but maybe just not fast enough, or are there wins at all?
I mean, I think there have certainly been wins, right? And I want to sit with what Larry said, that actually there have been quite a few shifts. But I think one thing that I struggle with a lot is that our notion of climate solutions, I think, needs to be more complicated, because not all of the things that we call climate solutions are, first of all, they're not all solutions for climate, but some of them exacerbate other issues that we might care about, right? There's climate solutions that can make housing issues work. There's climate solutions that can extract wealth or exploit labor. There's climate solutions that can even have implications for things like, mass incarceration or policing. Because of the way our systems work, when we say that we're moving more resources to climate, that is incredibly important. That is the first step, but then I think we need to talk about where specifically those resources are going. Because from our perspective at Chorus, we're not just concerned about the degrees and the greenhouse gases, we're concerned about what is the ripple effect that we can see in the economy, the ripple effect that we can see in other systems.
Larry Kramer, there's about $400 billion in charitable philanthropy in the United States every year. Climate is about, 1 or 2%. Why aren't more foundations funding climate?
Good question. So first, just to be clear, most of that $400 billion is in little individual contributions. So the organized philanthropy part is about $50 billion, still not, chump change. And of that, it's still less than 1%.
And most of it goes to churches and education.
Yeah, that's the individual stuff, not the foundation professional staff foundations. Their giving is quite different, but it's still not to climate by any, And I've struggled with this a lot. We're engaged in a major effort to try and bring more resources in, because I think part of the reason is a lot of people don't act. It's surprising to me how many funders really don't know or don't really fully appreciate what the climate thing is about. For many of them, the defeatism that has run through the public discussion, which is why I try and emphasize how much progress has been made. Who wants to give to a losing cause, and who wants to give to something that's hopeless and too big to get your arms around, which isn't true, but we have trouble really getting all that out. And for many, it's, the effects, now this is becoming less true, but the effects have felt distant and abstract. So, it's like if I drop a ball, it's not going to hit the ground till later. We're at the dropping phase, and until the ball's hitting, they don't really feel like they need to do anything. And I think it's different mixes of those for different people, but the net result is we need at least 2 or 3 times the resources we have.
And we're going to our lightning round. I'll mention a noun and ask our guests to mention the first thing that comes into their mind, unfiltered with reckless abandon. Tate Williams, the techno-optimism of Bill Gates.
Foolish.
Larry Kramer, WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks.
Where
not helpful.
There have been a lot of some disclosures of foundation.
Net not helpful. I'm thinking about the organization.
Farhad Ibrahimi, Michael Bloomberg.
A phrase, disagree on fracking.
Larry Kramer, impact investing.
Not as helpful as many people seem to think.
Farhad Ibrahimi, climate philanthropy's big wins.
Put in context.
True or false, Larry Kramer, income inequality is good for private philanthropy.
False.
Also, Larry
Not good for anybody.
Also, Larry Kramer, staff members at charitable foundations can get swollen egos with grant-seeking people continually telling them how smart and wonderful they are.
You really want me to answer that with one tiny little phrase? You're like, yes, of course, but we have term limits.
Farhad Ibrahimi, true or false, equality feels unfair to a person accustomed to privilege.
Absolutely true.
Also for Farhad, you can empathize with an individual white man who feels diminished by a changing world.
Yes.
Tate Williams, generosity is not a substitute for justice.
Yes, that's true.
Also Tate, on the whole, our world is a lot better because of charitable foundations and their well-intentioned work.
I would say false because you said a lot.
True or false, Larry Kramer, climate funders have learned too little from the success of the conservative movement.
Yes, I would agree with that, although not just climate funders.
This one is for Farhad Ibrahimi. No one should put more money under your control.
My personal control, he's talking about. Yes, nobody should.
And last one for Farhad. Many foundations have a fetish for counting toes and other measurable things.
Yes.
All right,
And then that's what you get is more toes.
Let's give a round of applause for them getting through the lightning round. Larry Kramer, you wrote a blog about listening to our critics and listening with empathy. So I'd like you to kind of expound a little bit about what you were talking about, how foundations need to listen with empathy to their critics.
Sure. So first, everybody needs to, but part of it was I understand why it's difficult in some fields, but in philanthropy, there's no excuse not to. And the idea is, it's really I was a law professor for many years, and I used to say the most important thing we would teach our students was how to really understand the argument on the other side, the way it seemed reasonable to that person. And then until you could do that, one, you wouldn't understand your own argument, not really. You wouldn't know its strengths and weaknesses. But two, you wouldn't actually understand where the ground for common understanding was. And often, even if you continued to disagree, it would bring down the temperature. And that what we've drifted into as a society is instead of people actually listening and engaging, we don't ignore the other side, but we either take their worst argument and treat it like their only argument, or we assume that they actually know we're right and attribute bad motives to them, they're self-interested or they're racist, or we say, well, they're a blank, and then you can fill in the blank, white man, Black Lives Matter supporter, Trump voter, whatever it is, and therefore I don't need to listen to them at all. And you see increasingly those as what passes for public argument. And as that happens, we accomplish less, we understand each other less, we find less room for common ground. And as I said, there's no inconsistency between believing passionately in a position and taking the time to understand the other side.